The morning sun was warm on Tom's face as he sat on his old farmhouse porch. He had just finished working all night as the county sheriff, but nobody would know it now. He was wearing his regular jeans and flannel shirt. His coffee steamed in his favorite mug as his dog Buddy curled up at his feet. "Just you and me today, boy," Tom said, scratching behind Buddy's ears. "No badges, no sirens, just peace and quiet." But the quiet morning didn't last long. The sound of tires on gravel made Buddy's ears perk up. A shiny golf cart came rolling up Tom's driveway, not even stopping at the gate. Behind the wheel sat Sarah Miller, head of the local Homeowners Association, with a thick stack of papers in her hand. "Good morning, Tom," Sarah called out with a fake smile as she stepped onto his property like she owned it. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Tom nodded, already feeling trouble coming. "Morning, Sarah. What brings you all the way out here?" Sarah waved her papers. "Well, I'm afraid we have some issues with your property. Your farmhouse doesn't meet our neighborhood standards." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Standards? I don't remember joining any HOA." Sarah laughed like Tom had told a silly joke. "Oh, you didn't have to join. Last month we expanded our boundaries to include your land. It's all legal, I assure you." She tapped her papers. "And I'm sorry to say, but this old house, that barn, and even your rooster, they're all breaking our rules." Tom took a slow sip of his coffee, hiding his surprise. Sarah had no idea she was talking to the county sheriff, the very person who knew exactly what was and wasn't legal in these parts. "That's interesting," Tom said calmly. "So you're telling me you took my land without asking?" "We're improving the area, Tom," Sarah said, looking around with disapproval. "Your property is, well, an eyesore. You have 30 days to fix everything or face consequences." Little did Sarah know she had just picked a fight with the wrong farmer. Tom set his coffee mug down and took the thick stack of papers from Sarah's hands. He flipped through them slowly, trying not to laugh at what he was seeing. "Let me get this straight," Tom said. "You're saying my barn doors are ugly, my fence is the wrong color, and my rooster is too loud?" Sarah nodded with pride. "That's right. And that pond of yours has to go too. Standing water attracts mosquitoes." She pointed to a line in the papers. "Page 7, Section 4. Buddy growled softly, sensing Tom's growing frustration. "Sarah," Tom said patiently, "this is a farm. Farms have roosters. Farms have ponds. My family has lived here for 3 generations. Sarah crossed her arms. "Well, it's not just a farm anymore. Now it's part of Pleasant Valley Estates, and we have standards to keep property values high." Tom looked across his fields to the new houses that had been built about a mile away. They'd been creeping closer over the years, but this was ridiculous. "I don't think you can just claim someone's land like that," Tom said, handing the papers back. Sarah refused to take them. "Those are your copies. And yes, we can. It's all been filed with the county." What Sarah didn't know was that Tom personally reviewed those kinds of filings as part of his job as sheriff. He knew no such paperwork had crossed his desk. 30 days, Tom," Sarah said, climbing back into her golf cart. "Fix these violations or we'll take action. Trust me, you don't want to see what happens when people ignore HOA rules." Tom watched her drive away, papers still in his hand. Buddy looked up at him with worried eyes. "Don't worry, boy," Tom said, patting his dog's head. "She has no idea who she's messing with. But I'm not going to play the sheriff card just yet. Let's see how far she's willing to take this." Tom didn't know it yet, but Sarah was about to take things much further than he could have imagined. 3 days later, Tom was at work in his sheriff's office. He was wearing his uniform and badge, reviewing permits for an upcoming county fair. His phone rang and he recognized the number of Judge Harris, his retired neighbor. "Morning, Judge," Tom answered cheerfully. "Tom?" The judge's voice was urgent and shaky. "Get home now. They're tearing down your farm." Tom sat up straight. "What? Who is?" "The HOA brought a demolition crew." Judge Harris was almost shouting. "They've already knocked down your barn. They're heading for your house next." Tom's heart raced as he grabbed his keys. "I'm on my way. Call Deputy Johnson and tell him to meet me there." Tom sped home with his police lights flashing. The 10-minute drive felt like hours. As he turned onto his property, his stomach dropped. His beautiful old barn was now just a pile of wood and metal. The windmill his grandfather had built was toppled over. The pond had been drained, leaving mud and confused fish flopping around. A large yellow bulldozer was facing his farmhouse, engine running. And there was Sarah Miller, standing with her arms crossed, a pleased smile on her face. Next to her was a man in a hard hat holding papers. Tom slammed his car door and marched toward them. Buddy came running from the house, barking wildly. What the hell do you think you're doing? Tom demanded. Sarah looked him up and down, noticing his uniform for the first time. Her smile faltered for just a second. Enforcing HOA regulations, she said, lifting her chin. I told you that you had 30 days. It's been 3 days. Tom shouted, pointing to the destroyed barn. That barn has stood for 80 years. The man in the hard hat looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, you said we had all the proper permits? Sarah waved her hand. We do. The house is a safety hazard, so we expedited the process. Tom turned to the demolition crew. Stop your machines right now. Does anyone here have a county demolition permit? The workers looked at each other nervously. One of them turned off his bulldozer. We don't need one, Sarah insisted. The HOA has jurisdiction. Tom took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Sarah, you've made a very big mistake today. Tom pulled out his phone and dialed a number without taking his eyes off Sarah. Mark, it's Sheriff Tom. I need you at my property right away. Bring the permit enforcement team. He paused, listening. Yes, unauthorized demolition. No valid permits. Thanks. Sarah's smug smile began to fade. Sheriff? You're the sheriff. Tom clipped his phone back to his belt. County Sheriff Tom Miller, yes. Have been for 8 years. The demolition crew started backing away. The foreman removed his hard hat. Ma'am, you never said anything about this being the sheriff's property. Sarah's face turned pale. I didn't know. Clearly, Tom said. He turned to the crew. I suggest you all stay put. Leaving a crime scene would only make this worse for you. Tom walked to his cruiser and pulled out a camera. He started taking pictures of the destruction, methodically documenting everything while Sarah stood frozen in place. The barn my grandfather built, Tom said, snapping photos. The windmill my father repaired every spring. He pointed to the drain pond. Those fish have been there for 3 generations. Judge Harris arrived in his old pickup truck. He got out and shook his head at the destruction. I tried to stop them, Tom. I know you did, Judge. Thank you. Tom handed him the camera. Would you mind continuing with the photos? I need to have a word with Ms. Miller. Tom walked back to Sarah, who was now frantically texting on her phone. Sarah, Tom said calmly. Put the phone down. She looked up, her hands shaking. I'm just letting the board know there's been a misunderstanding. Oh, it's far more than a misunderstanding, Tom replied. It's trespassing, destruction of property, filing false documents, and likely fraud. A police car pulled up and Deputy Johnson stepped out. Deputy, Tom called, please gather ID from everyone on the demolition crew and take their statements. Sarah finally seemed to understand the trouble she was in. Listen, Sheriff, we can work this out. The HOA can pay for the damages. Tom shook his head. This isn't just about the damages, Sarah. You demolished my property without legal authority. You claim to have annexed my land, which you can't do. And I'm betting those permits you mentioned don't exist. More county vehicles arrived. Mark from the permit office approached, clipboard in hand. Sheriff, he nodded to Tom. What a mess. We have no demolition permits issued for this address. Sarah's confident facade completely crumbled. I thought, the board said. Tom crossed his arms. I think it's time we had a look at exactly what the HOA has been up to. Over the next 24 hours, Sheriff Tom worked tirelessly. He gathered security camera footage from Judge Harris's property that showed the demolition crew arriving. He collected statements from confused HOA members who had no idea about the annexation of his land. And he dug into the HOA's financial records with help from the county auditor. What Tom found was shocking. Sarah Miller hadn't just targeted his farm on a whim. This was part of a pattern. The HOA had been issuing fake violations and collecting hefty fines from homeowners for years. But the money wasn't going toward community improvements as promised. Look at this, Tom said to Deputy Johnson, pointing at financial records spread across his office desk. Over $200,000 in fines collected last year, but only $30,000 spent on actual neighborhood projects. Deputy Johnson whistled. Where's the rest going? Tom flipped to another page. To a development company called Sunrise Properties. He turned his computer screen to show Johnson a website. Owned by Sarah's cousin, Robert Miller. The scheme became clear. Sarah was using HOA rules to force people to sell their homes cheap or pay enormous fines. Then her cousin's company would buy the properties and flip them for huge profits. Tom also discovered the HOA boundaries had never legally changed. The annexation was completely made up. She forged the documents, Mark from the permit office confirmed, examining the papers. This doesn't even have the right county seal. By evening, Tom had enough evidence for multiple charges. He sat in his office with the district attorney, reviewing everything. Fraud, embezzlement, destruction of property, forgery, the DA listed off. Your HOA president has been busy, Sheriff. Tom nodded grimly. And I want to make sure every HOA member knows exactly what's been happening to their money. What's your plan? The DA asked. Tom smiled for the first time in days. I hear there's an emergency HOA meeting tomorrow night. I think the sheriff's office should attend. The Pleasant Valley Estates Community Center was packed Thursday evening. News had spread that the HOA had demolished the sheriff's property, and everyone wanted answers. Board members sat nervously at a long table facing rows of folding chairs filled with homeowners. Sarah Miller stood at the podium trying to maintain control. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, Sarah began, her voice tight. We've had a small misunderstanding regarding property boundaries that. The door at the back of the room swung open. Sheriff Tom walked in, wearing his full uniform, badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Behind him came Deputy Johnson, Mark from the permit office, and two other county officials carrying boxes of documents. The room fell silent. Tom walked slowly down the center aisle, his boots echoing on the tile floor. Buddy trotted faithfully beside him. People whispered and pointed. Please continue, Ms. Miller, Tom said, crossing his arms. You were explaining this small misunderstanding that led to the destruction of my 80-year-old family barn. Sarah's face flushed red. Sheriff Miller, this is a private HOA meeting. I'm afraid you'll need to. Oh, I'm staying, Tom said, pulling a chair to the front row and sitting down. And so are my colleagues. We've brought some interesting reading material for everyone. Deputy Johnson and the others began distributing papers to the crowd. What is this? Demanded Harold Winston, an HOA board member. Tom stood back up, addressing the entire room. What you're holding is a complete audit of Pleasant Valley Estates' HOA finances for the past 3 years. You might want to pay special attention to page 4, the part showing where your money actually went. The room erupted as homeowners flipped through the documents. $6,000 for pool maintenance? We don't even have a pool, someone shouted. It says here I paid $1,200 in fines last year for unapproved lawn ornaments, but I got approval, yelled another. Harold Winston's face went pale as he read. Sarah, is this true? We've collected over $200,000 in fines but only spent $30,000 on the community. Sarah gripped the podium. These numbers are being taken out of context. We had plans for that money. Yes, you certainly did, Tom said, nodding to Mark, who started a projector. A large image appeared on the wall behind Sarah. Property records for Sunrise Development LLC. Plans that involved your cousin Robert's company buying up homes at discount prices after you forced sales with excessive fines and violations. The room descended into chaos. Board members shouted at Sarah while homeowners demanded refunds. Judge Harris, who had slipped in quietly, gave Tom an approving nod from the back row. Sarah tried desperately to regain control. Everyone please. This is all a misunderstanding. The sheriff is just angry about his property. Tom pulled out his phone and played a recording through the room's speakers. Sarah's voice filled the hall. Just keep finding violations. The more ridiculous the better. They'll either pay up or sell cheap, and either way we win. The recording silenced everyone. Sarah's face drained of all color. That's a private conversation. You can't. It was recorded by a homeowner during what they thought was a discussion about their garden fence, Tom explained. Single-party consent is legal in this state. Harold Winston stood up, trembling with anger. I joined this board to help our community, not to steal from my neighbors. He turned to Sarah. How could you do this? Before Sarah could answer, the doors opened again. 2 uniformed officers entered. Sarah Miller, Tom announced, these officers are here to take you into custody on charges of fraud, embezzlement, forgery of county documents, and destruction of property. You can't do this. Sarah shouted as the officers approached. I have rights. Yes, you do, Tom agreed calmly. And so did I when you tore down my barn without permission. He turned to address the shocked crowd. And all of you had rights too when she was charging you fake fines and stealing your money. As the officers led a protesting Sarah away, Tom took the podium. The room fell silent again. Folks, I'm not just here as the victim of HOA overreach. I'm here as your county sheriff. This kind of abuse of power stops today. He gestured to the county officials. We'll be setting up a table in the back. Anyone who believes they paid unjust fines can file for reimbursement. All HOA rules are suspended pending a complete investigation. A spontaneous cheer erupted. People stood applauding. Many approached Tom, sharing stories of their own battles with the HOA. An elderly woman grasped Tom's hand. "They fined me $500 for my bird feeder. Said it was an unauthorized structure. And I had to paint my door 3 times because the shade of blue wasn't exactly right," a man added. As the night went on, the full extent of Sarah's scheme became clear. She hadn't just targeted Tom's farm, she'd been terrorizing the entire neighborhood for years, using the HOA as her personal weapon and piggy bank. By midnight, when the community center finally emptied, Tom stood in the parking lot with Judge Harris, looking up at the stars. "You know," the judge said, "I never did like that woman. Too much power in too small a kingdom." Tom nodded. People like Sarah count on others being too afraid or too busy to stand up. They never expect someone to fight back. Or for that someone to be the county sheriff, Judge Harris chuckled. The look on her face when she realized who you were, priceless. Tom smiled, but it faded quickly as he thought about his demolished barn. "Now I just need to figure out how to rebuild everything she destroyed." The judge patted his shoulder. "Something tells me you won't be doing it alone." The wheels of justice turned swiftly in the weeks that followed. Sarah Miller sat in the county jail, unable to meet the $250,000 bail set by the judge. Her cousin Robert fled town when the news broke, but was caught trying to cross the state line with suitcases full of cash and HOA documents. Tom returned to his property each evening after work, assessing the damage and salvaging what he could. The old weather vane from the barn had somehow survived, and he kept it on his porch as a reminder. Buddy stayed close by his side, sensing his sadness. One evening, as Tom sat on his porch steps looking at the rubble, a truck pulled into his driveway. Then another. And another. Soon, his usually quiet farm was filled with vehicles. Harold Winston, the former HOA board member, stepped out of the first truck. Behind him came dozens of neighbors, some Tom recognized from the HOA meeting, others he'd never met. "Sheriff," Harold said, removing his hat. "We came to help." Tom stood, surprised. "Help with what?" "Rebuilding," Harold replied simply. "We all agreed it's the least we can do." A woman stepped forward, Lisa Chin, who lived in one of the newer houses. "I'm an architect," she said. "I drew up plans based on photos Judge Harris had of your barn. We can make it just like it was." Another man raised his hand. "I own the lumber yard in town. Materials are covered." Tom was speechless as more people introduced themselves. Carpenters, electricians, plumbers, all volunteering their time and skills. Even children came forward with hand-drawn pictures of what his farm used to look like, offering them as blueprints. "Why would you all do this?" Tom finally asked. "Most of you don't even know me." Harold looked ashamed. "Because we should have stopped Sarah long ago. Some of us suspected things weren't right, but we did nothing." He gestured to the crowd. "This is our way of making it right." The next Saturday, work began at dawn. The demolished barn was cleared away, and the foundation for a new one laid by noon. Teams worked on restoring the windmill, while others began refilling the pond. Tom worked alongside everyone, overwhelmed by the community's generosity. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, more charges were being filed against Sarah and her accomplices. The district attorney invited Tom to sit in as they reviewed the evidence. "The money trail is clear," the DA explained. "She's been running this scheme for years. And we found evidence she was planning to target 5 more properties, including old Mrs. Johnson's orchard." Tom shook his head. "She would have torn down a 100-year-old apple orchard?" 4 luxury condos, the DA confirmed. According to these plans. The legal consequences mounted. The court froze all of Sarah's assets, including her large house overlooking the valley. Civil lawsuits poured in from homeowners demanding their money back. The HOA itself was formally dissolved by unanimous vote of the residents. In a separate hearing, the judge ordered that Sarah's assets be liquidated to pay restitution. Her house would be sold, and the proceeds would go first to rebuilding Tom's farm, with the remainder distributed among other HOA victims. 3 weeks after the demolition, Tom stood in his yard looking at the new barn. It wasn't exactly the same. Nothing could replace what had been lost, but it was beautiful in its own way. The community had even added a plaque, "Miller Family Farm EST 1943, rebuilt by Friends 2024. The pond was full again with new fish swimming lazily beneath lily pads. The windmill turned in the breeze. And most importantly, neighbors who had once been strangers now stopped by regularly, bringing food, stories, and friendship. That evening, as Tom sat on his porch watching the sunset with Buddy, a county car pulled up. Deputy Johnson stepped out, holding an official envelope. "Just came through," Johnson said, handing it to Tom. "Thought you'd want to see it right away." Tom opened it and smiled at the contents, the judge's final ruling in his lawsuit. Not only had he been awarded full damages, but Sarah Miller was permanently banned from serving on any HOA board or purchasing property in the county again. "Justice served," Deputy Johnson said with satisfaction. Tom folded the paper back into the envelope. "You know, Johnson, I've been thinking about something." "What's that, Sheriff?" "Maybe we need some new county regulations. Something to prevent HOAs from gaining too much power in the first place." Johnson nodded. "Sounds like a good idea to me. After all, who better to write those rules than someone who's seen the damage firsthand?" Tom looked out over his rebuilt farm and the new friends who had helped restore it. Sometimes, he thought, good things could come even from the worst situations. "I'll start drafting something tomorrow," Tom said. "For now, want to stay for dinner?" The neighbors brought enough food to feed half the county. 6 months later, Tom's farm had transformed from a scene of destruction to a picture of rural beauty. The new barn stood proud and tall, painted the same deep red as the original but with modern touches that made it even better. The windmill's blades turned gracefully in the autumn breeze, and the pond had become home to a family of ducks that Buddy watched with curious fascination. But the most remarkable change wasn't to the property, it was to the community. On this particular Saturday morning, cars lined Tom's long driveway and spilled onto the road. Picnic tables dotted his sprawling front yard, loaded with home-cooked dishes. Children chased each other between apple trees while adults gathered in small groups, laughing and talking. This was the first annual Good Neighbor Day, an idea born from the disaster of Sarah's HOA scheme. Tom stood on his porch, now wearing jeans and a flannel shirt instead of his uniform, watching the celebration unfold. Judge Harris joined him, offering a glass of homemade lemonade. "Quite a turnout," the judge observed. Tom nodded, smiling. "Never thought I'd have half the county on my property by choice." The Pleasant Valley community had transformed in the months since Sarah's arrest. With the HOA dissolved, neighbors had created something new in its place, a voluntary community association focused on helping each other rather than enforcing rules. They pooled resources for things that mattered: emergency assistance for families in need, community gardens, and educational programs for children. Harold Winston, now head of the new association, approached the porch. "Sheriff, they're ready for you." Tom nodded and followed Harold to a makeshift podium near the barn. The crowd quieted as he stepped up to speak. "First, I want to thank everyone for coming today," Tom began, looking across the faces of people who had become friends. "A year ago, most of us were strangers despite living just miles apart. It took something terrible to bring us together, but I'm grateful for what we've built from those ruins." He gestured to a large framed document on an easel beside him. "Today, I'm proud to announce that the county board has unanimously passed the Homeowner Protection Act, which sets clear limits on what HOAs can and cannot do in our county. No more surprise annexations. No more demolishing property without proper permits. And a clear process for homeowners to appeal unfair rulings." Applause erupted from the crowd. "The law also requires financial transparency," Tom continued. "All HOA budgets must be publicly available to members, with regular independent audits." More applause, even louder this time. "But laws can only do so much," Tom said, his voice growing serious. "What really matters is how we treat each other. Sarah Miller didn't just break laws, she broke trust. She forgot that the purpose of a community isn't to control your neighbors, but to support them." Tom looked across the gathering, families from all walks of life, united by their shared experience and determination to build something better. "Look around," he continued. "This is what a real community looks like. Not perfect, not without disagreements, but built on respect and genuine care for each other." Lisa Chin stepped forward, carrying a covered object. She placed it on the podium beside Tom. "The community has one more surprise for you, Sheriff," she said, smiling. Tom removed the cloth to reveal a beautifully carved wooden sign. "Miller Family Farm, Protected County Historical Site, E. 1943. We filed the paperwork last month," Lisa explained. "Your farm is now officially a historical landmark. No one can ever threaten it again." Tom ran his fingers over the carved letters, genuinely moved. He thought of his grandfather who had built the original barn, and his father who had taught him to care for this land. He wished they could see how the community had come together to protect their legacy. As for Sarah Miller, she was serving a 5-year sentence for fraud and embezzlement. Her cousin Robert had turned state's evidence against her for a reduced sentence. The money they had stolen, over $400,000, had been returned to the community members they had wronged. Tom often thought about stopping by the prison to visit Sarah, to ask her why she had been so determined to destroy his farm. But in the end, he decided some questions weren't worth answering. Better to focus on rebuilding than dwelling on destruction. The celebration continued as afternoon turned to evening. Lanterns were strung between trees, casting a warm glow over the gathering. Someone brought out a fiddle and impromptu dancing began near the barn. Tom sat on his porch steps with Buddy watching his neighbors, his friends, enjoying themselves on his land. Judge Harris settled beside him with a plate of pie. "You know," the judge said thoughtfully, "your grandfather would be mighty proud of what you've done here." Tom looked around at his restored farm, at the community he had helped build, at the new protections for homeowners across the county. "I hope so," he replied. I think he'd say it was worth fighting for. As darkness fell, fireflies began to dance above the pond. Children chased them with jars, their laughter carrying across the property. Tom leaned back against the porch post, feeling a deep contentment. Sometimes, he reflected, it takes losing something precious to discover something even more valuable. The power of a true community standing together against those who would abuse their power. And sometimes, just sometimes, the bad guys picked the absolute worst farm to mess with. 1 year to the day after the HOA had demolished his barn, Sheriff Tom Miller sat on his porch swing, gently rocking back and forth. Buddy lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to watch the golden sunset spreading across the fields. The farm had never looked better. The barn stood tall and strong, built even better than before. The pond rippled with fish jumping for evening insects, and the windmill turned smoothly in the gentle breeze. Around the property, small plaques detailed the farm's history for visitors who now frequently came to see the famous place where an HOA's reign of terror had finally ended. Tom sipped his coffee, thinking about how much had changed in a year. Sarah Miller was still in prison, but he'd heard she had started teaching other inmates about legal rights and property laws, an ironic but positive turn. The former HOA members had transformed into a voluntary community support group that actually helped people instead of harassing them. The most surprising change had come just last month. Tom's story had gone viral online after a local news report. Soon he was getting calls from people all across the country facing similar HOA problems. He started offering advice, then formal consultations. Eventually, he set up a small nonprofit organization to help homeowners stand up to HOA overreach. The phone on the porch table rang and Tom checked the caller ID. It was Harold Winston. "Evening, Harold," Tom answered. "Everything okay?" "More than okay," Harold replied excitedly. "The governor just signed it. The Homeowner Protection Act is now state law, not just county. They're calling it the sheriff's law informally." Tom smiled. The bill he had helped draft had expanded beyond their county, providing protections for homeowners throughout the entire state. "That's great news, Harold. Really great." After hanging up, Tom walked to the edge of his porch and looked out over his property. In the distance, he could see the lights of the Pleasant Valley homes beginning to twinkle in the dusk. Once they had seemed like an encroaching threat. Now they were just neighbors, friends who waved when they drove by. Judge Harris's truck rumbled up the driveway. The elderly judge had become a regular visitor, often bringing legal books or just stopping by to chat. "Heard the news?" the judge called as he climbed out of his truck. "Just now," Tom confirmed. Still hard to believe. The judge joined Tom on the porch. "You know, when my father was sheriff here back in the 60s, he always said the badge wasn't about having power, it was about protecting people from those who abused power." Tom nodded. "Wise man. He would have been proud of how you handled this," the judge continued. "Not just enforcing the law but changing it to make it better." As night fell completely, they sat in comfortable silence. Across Tom's property, fireflies began to blink, like stars fallen to earth. Buddy snoozed contentedly between them. "You ever regret not telling Sarah who you were right away?" the judge asked finally. "Might have saved your barn." Tom thought about it, then shook his head. "If I had, she might have backed off just because I was the sheriff. The HOA would have kept bullying everyone else." He gestured toward the community in the distance. "This way, everyone got justice, not just me." In the years since the confrontation, Tom had received numerous offers to sell his land to developers. Each time he politely declined. This farm wasn't just property, it was a reminder that standing up for what's right mattered, even when it would be easier to give in. A shooting star streaked across the night sky. The judge pointed it out and both men watched its brief, brilliant path. "Make a wish?" the judge asked with a smile. Tom looked around at his peaceful farm, at the thriving community beyond, at the new law that would protect homeowners for generations to come. "No need," he said contentedly. "I've got everything I wished for right here." Buddy thumped his tail in agreement, as if to say that sometimes, the best victories aren't just winning the fight, they're building something better from the aftermath.